Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable persistence of medieval mysteries, stories once dismissed as legend, conspiracy, or drunken monk exaggeration, now unravelling under the cold, quiet gaze of modern science. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Lincoln Cathedral, that grand Gothic pile where medieval England tried its absolute best to impress God with flying buttresses, stained glass and stonework so dramatic it might have been designed by a stressed-out theatre kid with a chisel. In the 1960s, beneath this architectural flex, archaeologists unearthed a skeleton. Naturally, everyone assumed it was a monk, because what else would a dead guy be doing under a medieval cathedral? Yoga. Except, this one was all wrong. No robes, no sacred trinkets, no dramatic arms crossed in holy resignation pose. He looked less like Brother Gregory and more like Steve who got lost on the way to Canterbury. He was buried face down, with the haphazard grace of someone hidden during a panic. Which, in medieval England, could mean anything from heresy to sneezing too close to the bishop. And then science got involved, specifically isotope analysis, aka bone T reading. Turns out, our mystery skeleton wasn't local at all. He was Scandinavian, which explained the sturdy bones, worn knees, and the faint echo of longboat chants when the wind blew through the crypt. This guy was a pilgrim, not a monk. He had walked, all the way from Northern Europe, probably hoping for a miracle, or at least a decent relic. He ended up collapsing somewhere near the cathedral. Whether from divine rapture or medieval shin splints, no one knows. He was buried beneath the church, likely because the clergy couldn't just toss a Scandinavian corpse in the street. That's bad PR. But they didn't exactly roll out the sacred burial wine either. He got a low-key hole and a shrug. For centuries, people thought he'd done something disgraceful. Turns out he just believed a little too hard and had no idea how much walking was involved. Classic pilgrim behaviour. The real mystery. How this guy survived all that distance on a diet of salted fish and questionable bread and still didn't get canonized. So no, he wasn't a monk. He was just extremely tired. Moral of the story? If you're going to walk across Europe for spiritual reasons, at least wear a name tag that says, not a heretic, just devoted. Once upon a time, in a land of history books and bad haircuts, there lived a king named Richard III. You may remember him as the hunchbacked villain from Shakespeare's play, the guy who shouted, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Which, to be fair, sounds like the kind of thing you say after realising Uber doesn't exist yet. But for centuries, Richard III's remains were missing. Vanished. Disappeared somewhere between the Battle of Bosworth and someone sweeping up the royal battlefield like, yeah, we'll just deal with this later. Well, it turns out later meant over 500 years. Enter a parking lot in Leicester. Yes, not a castle, not a crypt, not even a suspicious-looking well. Just your average boring car park behind a city council building. Apparently that's where royal dignity goes to die. In 2012, a group of very determined archaeologists, armed with ground-penetrating radar and, frankly, a shocking level of optimism, decided to dig up said parking lot. Why? Because some medieval records vaguely suggested that Richard was buried at the nearby Greyfriars Church, which had since been demolished, paved over, and rebranded as Parking Bay No. 7. They found a skeleton. Male. Late 30s. Skull caved in like he'd lost a very serious argument with a sword. Spine twisted like a medieval IKEA assembly gone wrong. In other words, a perfect match. DNA testing confirmed it. Not with some grand royal relic, but by swabbing the cheek of a Canadian guy who turned out to be Richard's 16 times great-nephew. Imagine finding out you're related to royalty, but only because your great-great-great-granduncle got dumped under asphalt. So yes, Richard III was found under a parking lot, ending centuries of speculation and giving British tabloids the kind of pun material they hadn't seen since Henry VIII's sixth wife. Royally parked? Anyone? The mystery of his grave? Solved. His reputation? Still complicated. But at least he's now reburied with honour, no longer sharing his eternal rest with oil stains and gum wrappers. Discovered in 1912 by a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, this mysterious medieval text has puzzled historians, cryptographers, and one very determined guy in his mom's basement for over a century. Written in a completely unknown script and language, it looked like a medieval scholar drank one too many herbal tonics and decided to invent an alphabet, and a plant taxonomy, and possibly a new religion involving naked women in bathtubs. The manuscript itself is a fever dream on vellum. 240 pages of undecipherable writing, bizarre star charts, nude women floating in green goo, and plants that botany professors describe as nope, not real. It's basically what you'd get if a herbalist and an alien collaborated on a colouring book. For decades, people assumed it was a hoax, maybe a prank played on some poor medieval nobleman with more gold than brain cells. Others suggested it was a lost language, or the diary of an extremely eccentric wizard. But recently, drumroll please, artificial intelligence and linguistic analysis actually cracked parts of it. Not the whole thing, of course. That would be too satisfying. But enough to ruin some of the mystery and give the academic world a reason to high-five in Latin. Turns out, the language may be a form of proto-romance, an early offshoot of Latin that no one thought was ever written down. So, basically, medieval slang, like finding out someone carved LOL into a monastery wall in the year 1420. Some phrases were decoded: herbal remedies, female health tips, a medieval zodiac, which means the Voynich manuscript isn't a map to the Holy Grail or instructions for time travel. It's more like a 15th century wellness blog. Gwyneth Paltrow, but make it parchment. So yes, the mystery is kinda solved. It's not nonsense. It's just health advice written in a dying dialect, illustrated by someone who clearly had very specific feelings about bathtubs. The real question is, who wrote it? Why? And did they ever imagine people in the year 2024 would still be squinting at their herbal doodles like it held the secrets to the universe? Probably not. But hey, at least we know it wasn't just medieval gibberish. It was meaningful medieval gibberish. Somewhere in 12th century Suffolk, in a sleepy little village called Woolpit, which sounds like either a charming English hamlet or an aggressive sheep trap, 2 children appeared out of nowhere. And we mean nowhere. They just kind of showed up. No parents, no explanation, no TikTok announcement. But the real kicker? They were green. Not metaphorically green, like new to the job, but actually botanically green, like salad, or someone who took the phrase, "you are what you eat," far too literally. According to the chroniclers, and medieval chroniclers never exaggerated obviously, these children spoke no known language, wore weird clothes, and looked like they had just escaped from a very serious painting by Hieronymus Bosch. Naturally, the villagers did the medieval equivalent of a wellness check. They tried to feed them bread and beans. The children refused all food except raw beans, because clearly they were picky and possibly photosynthetic. Eventually they started eating normal food, and, wouldn't you know it, their green hue faded. Turns out being green might have had less to do with aliens and more to do with severe malnutrition. Because if you go long enough without eating anything but beans, apparently your body says, you know what? Let's just go chlorophyll and hope for the best. The boy sadly died soon after, not unusual for the Middle Ages, where eating a suspicious mushroom could be fatal, and so could not eating at all. But the girl survived, learned English, and spilled the metaphorical beans. They came from a place with no sun and eternal twilight, and they were herding their father's cattle when they somehow wandered into Woolpit through a cave. Naturally, the modern explanation is that they were Flemish refugees, kids who fled political conflict, got lost, suffered dietary deficiencies, and got mistaken for forest elves. It happens, especially in England. Let's set the scene. A quiet English church candles flickering, Latin chants echoing through the stone vaults. The priest is mid-sermon, probably warning everyone about eternal damnation or the dangers of cheese on Fridays. Meanwhile, somewhere in the pews, one peasant teenager is etching a crude doodle of a sword fight on the wall, for posterity, and possibly revenge. For centuries, strange carvings inside English churches had people scratching their heads, and not just because the benches were made of splintered oak. These symbols were long thought to be protective marks against demons. You know, witches' traps, hex wards, circles to confuse evil spirits who apparently failed geometry. Some of the marks do look ominous. Interlocking circles, stars, odd runes, daisy wheels. Yes, daisy wheels. The terrifying flower of doom. Victorian scholars got very excited about these and decided that obviously medieval people were constantly terrified of being dragged to hell by goat-hooved demons during Mass. Which, to be fair, was probably more exciting than the actual sermon. But then came the spoilsports. Modern archaeologists with their laser scanners and rational explanations. After thoroughly documenting over 28,000 pieces of medieval graffiti, they found that, shockingly, many of them weren't demonic in nature at all. In fact, some were just names, or drawings of ships, or swords, or cats. Turns out, church graffiti was often done by regular parishioners, bored, devout, or both, leaving marks for reasons ranging from personal devotion to "I was here, Gerald, 1378. Some were votive symbols, requesting protection or commemorating prayers. Others were probably the medieval equivalent of carving your crush's initials into a school desk. And while some symbols do have a magical bent, a few circles might be hex warding, the idea that every mark was a desperate attempt to trap Satan in a doodle is, well, optimistic at best. So the next time you wander through an ancient English church and spot a scratched outline of a medieval sword fight, or someone's name in jagged lettering, just know, it's not a warning of demonic infestation, it's just Gerald. Bored Gerald, who couldn't sit through another 2-hour homily without expressing himself via blunt instrument on soft limestone. In the annals of medieval mythology, Rungholt has long been whispered about like a soggy Atlantis, a wealthy city swallowed whole by the sea as punishment for its arrogance, pride, and probably subpar tithing. It was said to have sunk in a single night in 1362, during a massive storm called the Grote Mandrenke, or Great Drowning of Men, which is also what happens when you try to cross a North Sea pub crawl during a storm surge. For centuries, people debated whether Rungholt even existed. Some believed it was just a fable to scare coastal villagers into humility, the medieval German version of "clean your room, or the sea will eat your entire town." Others insisted it was real, but had long since been lost beneath layers of silt, salt, and sheep. Legend said Rungholt was decadent. The people were wealthy, godless, and so rude they once refused lodging to a beggar priest. Naturally, God responded in classic Old Testament fashion, with a flood, because nothing says divine justice like aquatic urban renewal. But modern archaeologists have recently confirmed that yes, Rungholt existed. And yes, it absolutely got wrecked by the sea. Thanks to LiDAR scans, sonar mapping, and some very muddy German researchers in galoshes, parts of Rungholt's harbour walls, drainage systems, and dikes have finally been found beneath the Wadden Sea. And guess what? It turns out Rungholt wasn't a fairy tale. It was a thriving North Frisian port city. The area had advanced water control systems, tons of trade, and presumably a whole lot of people who now wish they hadn't settled in a literal swamp next to the ocean. The cause of its destruction wasn't just divine wrath, it was climate change. Medieval Europe was warming, storm surges were rising, and dike maintenance was, let's say, budget-constrained. So when the 1362 storm hit, Rungholt was about as prepared as a sandcastle facing a tsunami. Ah, the Knights Templar, history's favourite combination of holy warriors, secret symbols and conspiracy theories involving treasure, grails, and angry church officials. So when a cave in Shropshire, England, was discovered containing mysterious carvings, candle niches, and a suspicious lack of wine racks, the internet predictably exploded into Templar confirmed mode. Enter the Cainton Caves, a sandstone network beneath a farmer's field that looks like the set of a very budget medieval horror film, or possibly a dungeon escape room run by monks. With narrow passages, low ceilings, and intricately carved pillars, it didn't take long before whispers began. Templars, secret rituals, holy relics. Indiana Jones would love this. For years, rumours swirled that this cave had been used by the Knights Templar themselves after they were outlawed in the 14th century. Hidden underground, performing forbidden rites, probably whispering Latin prayers while trying not to bump their helmets on the ceiling. The dramatic lighting in photographs didn't help. The place looked like it belonged in a Dan Brown novel, or at the very least, a particularly committed LARP session. But here's where the recent research comes in to ruin everyone's fun. The cave is probably not that old. Most signs point to the structure being 19th century in origin. That's right, Victorian era, which means the Templars were long gone, and the only secret society using this place may have been a group of bored gentlemen with a flair for the theatrical. There were mysterious rituals, of course. Members of fringe spiritualist groups are known to have used the cave in the 20th century, and modern-day pagans, goths, and at least one wedding photographer have all visited for the ambience. So yes, weird things happened in that cave. But not the medieval kind. More the, we're all wearing cloaks and chanting for no clear reason kind. And while it's technically possible the cave repurposed older sites, there's no hard evidence linking it to the actual Templars. No relics, no inscriptions, not even a good old-fashioned sword stuck in a stone. Ah yes, the Princes in the Tower, a mystery so famous it has its own genre of historical finger-pointing. In the summer of 1483, two royal brothers, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 12 and 9 respectively, vanished from the Tower of London. And not in the got bored and wandered off kind of way. More the likely murdered by political ambition, wearing a fancy doublet sort of vibe. For centuries, everyone had a favourite suspect. Richard III, their charmingly hunchbacked uncle, topped the charts as the likely culprit. After all, he was the one who locked them up for their protection and then mysteriously became king, which is always a suspicious career move. But then you've got Henry VII, who defeated Richard and married the prince's sister, conveniently uniting the family line and ensuring that if anyone asked too many questions, there were no royal nephews left to challenge him. He also may have quietly disposed of the bodies, because why let your rival keep the murder spotlight? Now, fast forward to 1674, when workers at the tower dug up a wooden box under a staircase. Inside? Two small skeletons, suspiciously child-sized, and conveniently unaccompanied by any context or helpful post-it notes. Charles II, never one to overthink things, declared these must be the princes and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey like royal lost luggage. But here's the kicker. Those bones have never been definitively identified. No carbon dating, no DNA testing, just royal vibes and a suspicious staircase. Until now, well, almost. Recent pressure from historians and scientists has pushed the Crown and the Church of England to consider DNA testing the bones, possibly comparing them to known royal descendants. In theory, we could now tell whether the bones belonged to the two York princes, or some poor unrelated medieval kids who got the short end of the architectural renovation stick. The mystery, however, remains unresolved, just barely. The tools are ready. The science is there. The permissions are very British and delayed. But for the first time, we're on the verge of a scientific resolution to a murder mystery older than most castles. Let's set the scene. Strasbourg, Holy Roman Empire, 1518. A woman named Frau Trophea walks into the street and starts dancing. Not fun dancing, not festival dancing, not even wine and regret dancing. No, she danced like her life depended on it. Because according to some witnesses, it might have. Within a week, dozens joined her. Within a month, Reports say up to 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others suffered strokes, heart attacks, and in at least a few cases, danced themselves to death. Historians call it the dancing plague, which sounds like a rejected Eurovision entry. But the sources are surprisingly consistent. It wasn't a party. It wasn't a flash mob. It was a bizarre, involuntary mass event that left people in serious medical distress. Naturally, the medieval authorities did the logical thing. They built a stage and hired musicians. Because if people are dying from dancing, clearly what they need is a better beat and more cowbell. That'll fix it. But what was this strange epidemic of boogieing doom? For centuries, people guessed wildly. Some said demonic possession. Others blamed hot blood, because medieval medicine had all the scientific rigour of a horoscope. One theory even involved spider bites, which, to be fair, would make me dance too. Today, however, modern scholars lean toward two more plausible explanations: mass psychogenic illness and ergot poisoning. Mass psychogenic illness, as known as group hysteria, can happen in communities under extreme stress. And Strasbourg in 1518, famine, plague, political instability, and all the makings of a society wound tighter than a lute string. Basically, these folks needed therapy and bread, not a stage show. The other theory is ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and produces LSD-like hallucinations. It's the same culprit often blamed for the Salem witch trials. So yes, it's possible these people were tripping hard, and instead of seeing demons, they just felt the irresistible need to groove. Recent re-evaluations of the event suggest a mix of trauma, malnutrition, religious fervour, and possibly toxic bread. A recipe for either a trance state or a medieval EDM festival gone very wrong. Let's talk about a teenage king with leprosy who outlived most of his enemies, ruled with surprising competence, and died young enough to make a rock band jealous. Welcome to the baffling, tragic, and surprisingly dignified story of Baldwin IV, as known as the Leper King of Jerusalem. When Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy as a boy, everyone assumed he'd die quickly and quietly, preferably off stage and with a generic footnote in history. Instead, he became king at 13, led armies into battle, outsmarted Saladin, and ruled for over a decade, with leprosy, in the 12th century. While everyone around him was busy dying of paper cuts and suspicious cheese. The question that's puzzled historians is, what kind of leprosy did he actually have? Was it really the disfiguring, slow-burning disease we picture from medieval art? Or was it something else? Something exaggerated for political drama, like medieval PR spin? Recent studies suggest Baldwin may have had tuberculoid leprosy, a milder form of Hansen's disease that affects nerves and skin, but doesn't necessarily lead to the full melting face aesthetic. In fact, chronic nerve damage and muscle atrophy could explain why he slowly lost the ability to use his arms and legs, but kept his mind razor sharp. There's also a theory he might have had another neurological disease entirely, something like Charcot-Marie tooth disease, which also causes muscle weakness, limb deformities, and numbness. If true, it would mean that for centuries, people just pointed at a sick teen and yelled, "Leper," the way we now blame Mercury in retrograde. Contemporary accounts describe Baldwin as physically deteriorating, but mentally sharp until the end. He fought battles, arranged diplomatic marriages, and even appointed his own successor, all while being unable to hold a sword or mount a horse without assistance. So what really killed him? Most likely complications from progressive nerve degeneration, infections, and medieval medicine's just throw herbs at it approach. He died at 24, which, for someone managing a crumbling kingdom and his own body falling apart, was frankly a miracle. So, yes, we've mostly solved the mystery. He wasn't a zombie king or a holy miracle. He was just a deeply unlucky but politically competent teenager in a brutal world. And if that's not the most medieval job description ever, I don't know what is. Somewhere in medieval Europe, a convent cemetery was being excavated by modern archaeologists expecting the usual: bones, rosary beads, and maybe a humble shoe buckle or two. Instead, what they found was a female skeleton buried in a religious habit, clearly a nun, whose grave contained not one, but two skeletons. Hers. And that of a newborn infant nestled against her ribs. Well, that's awkward. Naturally, this sent scholars spiralling into speculation. Had she been the victim of assault? Was it a secret affair with a priest? Did the cloistered garden have more than just apples growing in secret? Enter ancient DNA testing, the 21st century equivalent of medieval confession, only less forgiving. Genetic analysis confirmed the infant was biologically her child. No more, maybe the Virgin Mary sent a miracle theories. This nun had very much broken the vow of chastity, and not with subtlety. Now, to be fair, childbirth in a convent wasn't entirely unheard of. Medieval records are full of monastic scandals, most of which were buried along with the evidence. But finding actual remains? That's rare. So the mystery then became, what happened to her? And why wasn't she punished or excommunicated? Well, the burial told us more than a trial record ever could. She was buried with full religious rites, suggesting the convent forgave her, or more likely, tried to keep things very quiet. Medieval monastic communities were self-governing, and it wasn't uncommon to handle things internally, especially if a scandal might attract attention from the bishop, or, heaven forbid, Rome. Was the child's father a passing knight, a local farmhand, or a particularly persuasive abbot? That part remains unsolved. But one theory suggests rape or coercion may have played a role, based on pelvic trauma, though others argue it could simply reflect complications from childbirth. As with all things medieval, the truth is foggy, sad, and smells faintly of incense. What we do know is this: a nun gave birth in secret, died during labour, and was quietly laid to rest. Child in arms, habits intact. And centuries later, DNA analysis pulled her secret back into the light, leaving modern researchers red-faced and medieval ones spinning in their graves. For decades, a bizarre skull found in a medieval European grave had people whispering about aliens, mutants, or possibly a very avant-garde helmet experiment gone wrong. Elongated cranium, weird proportions, haunting sockets, the whole package. If you stumbled across it on a late-night documentary, you'd expect a narrator saying, "Could this be evidence of extraterrestrial visitors?" Short answer, no. Slightly longer answer, someone's mum had very ambitious aesthetic goals for her baby. The skull in question had been intentionally cranially deformed, a process where an infant's head is bound with cloth, boards, or little wooden hats to mould it into a specific shape over time. And yes, this was totally normal in some medieval cultures, especially among nomadic tribes or fringe aristocrats who wanted their children to grow up with regal vibes and a forehead that could double as a battering ram. The practice dates back thousands of years and isn't unique to medieval Europe. But what made this particular skull famous was the extreme degree of elongation, the eerie preservation, and, let's be honest, our modern obsession with aliens and body horror. It didn't help that for years the skull was housed in a local museum's mystery cabinet, right next to a mummified hand and a taxidermy fox with two heads. Recent advances in forensic anthropology and DNA analysis finally put the mystery to rest. Scientists confirmed the skull belonged to a woman, probably high status, likely part of the Huns, or another steppe group migrating through Europe during the early medieval period. In other words, no UFO, no curse, no alien baby, just an extremely committed mum and a very cooperative baby. The intention wasn't to make them look strange, but beautiful, according to the standards of the time. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of braces, Botox, and a TikTok filter, all applied before your first birthday. And lest you scoff, remember that modern humans still engage in voluntary aesthetic torture: high heels, corsets, eyebrow threading. At least medieval skull shaping came with lifetime results. No maintenance required. So, picture this. Some kid in England is skipping rocks across a lake probably pretending he's in a video game or being mildly medieval, when suddenly, clunk. His rock hits something. Not a frog, not a boot, a full-blown sword, and just like that, every local news anchor dusted off their Excalibur puns and gave the story more airtime than municipal elections. To be clear, this wasn't King Arthur's sword. That one was allegedly tossed into the lake by Sir Bedivere, and a mysterious hand emerged to catch it, which was a totally reasonable plot point in a time when people believed in dragons and taxes from the church. But back to reality. What the girl found was an actual medieval sword, buried in the lake bed for hundreds of years. It was long, rusted, and, most suspiciously, perfectly shaped like the kind you'd use to defend a muddy castle from Vikings, or to enforce questionable feudal land disputes. Archaeologists stepped in, excited to date the blade and explain its presence in the water. And no, it wasn't Excalibur, but it was a genuine 9th to 11th century weapon, likely of Anglo-Saxon origin. So, what was it doing at the bottom of a lake? Here's where things get squishy. One theory? Ritual deposition. The practice of throwing valuable items into lakes or rivers as offerings to gods or spirits. Think of it as medieval Amazon returns, except the recipient is a deity who lives in algae. Another possibility? Panic dump. Imagine a knight running from battle, realizes he's about to be arrested or robbed, and flings the sword into the lake with the enthusiasm of someone ditching a phone before it incriminates them. Or, and this is the most likely, accidental loss. Medieval people fished, washed clothes, and sometimes fought near lakes. If you've ever dropped your phone in a toilet, you understand how easy it is to lose something valuable to water. Somewhere in the English countryside, tucked between sheep pastures and pubs with names like the Drunken Duck, stand a group of ancient stones ominously named the Whispering Knights. They're part of the larger Rollright Stones complex, a prehistoric circle of megaliths that look like a druid's IKEA set, long abandoned mid-assembly. Now, the knights aren't exactly knight-shaped. They're 5 tall, jagged stones leaning in towards each other, like they're gossiping at the medieval office water cooler. For centuries, locals believed these stones whispered secrets to each other, especially on moonlit nights, or when you turned your back on them like a complete idiot in a horror movie. Folklore insisted they were cursed knights turned to stone for trying to overthrow a king. Naturally, because in medieval Britain, if you so much as jaywalked, someone declared you a statue by divine punishment. The tale was charming, until scientists showed up and, with the finesse of a buzzkill in a fairy tale, said, "Let's study the geology." So what did modern analysis reveal? First off, the stones weren't knights. They were just Neolithic, dating back to 3500 BCE, long before chainmail and grail quests. They're aligned in a way that suggests ritual purpose, possibly astronomical, like so many other megalithic sites. Basically, Neolithic people loved big rocks and pointing them at the stars. You know, as one does. But what about the whispering? Here's where things get fun. Acoustic tests found that sound does behave strangely around the stones. Their shape and position create localized echo chambers, meaning whispers spoken in certain directions bounce and carry in unexpected ways. In a pre-science world, this naturally meant witchcraft, curses, or that the rocks were gossiping about your haircut. So while they're not knights, and they're not whispering juicy medieval secrets, they do serve as proof that our ancestors were deeply fascinated with space, sound, and probably freaking out visitors. Today, the Whispering Knights still lean in like they're sharing the latest scandal. And to be fair, if you've stood next to a mildly suspicious group at a party, you know how unsettling that body language can be. Are they haunted? Probably not. But acoustically suspicious? Absolutely. In medieval Europe, if your body refused to decompose properly after death, you had 2 career options: saint or supernatural menace. There was no third path. If the local priest liked you, congratulations. You were a holy miracle and possibly getting your own stained glass window. If not, get ready for an exhumation and a wooden stake through the ribcage. For centuries, tales circulated of corpses that just wouldn't rot. Monks, nobles, even ordinary townsfolk occasionally made headlines, well, parchment margins, for staying suspiciously well preserved. The living, naturally terrified of being haunted, blamed the usual suspects: sorcery, demonic possession, or just bad vibes. One particularly strange case took place in a small monastery in Eastern Europe. A nun, quiet, pious, and aggressively average in life, was buried during winter. But when her remains were moved months later, her body was found completely intact. Cue whispers of sainthood, candlelight vigils, and at least one terrified kitchen boy fainting on the spot. Fast forward to modern times, and enter science with its usual party-crashing facts. Researchers recently analysed several preserved medieval corpses using high-tech methods such as DNA sequencing, forensic chemistry, and, most thrilling of all, fungal swabbing. What they found was far less mystical and far more microbiological. Turns out, under the right conditions, a body can dehydrate rapidly, especially in cold, dry crypts, which essentially mummifies the remains. This natural preservation, called saponification in some cases, where fat turns into a waxy soap-like substance, can happen without any embalming, curses, or divine intervention. Just good old physics and fungi. As for our holy nun, she was buried during a harsh winter in a particularly airy stone crypt with lime-packed soil, nature's walk-in freezer, no demons, no miracles, just a medieval version of vacuum-sealing leftovers. The best part? While the village once lit candles in her honour, modern analysis revealed her diet consisted almost entirely of pickled fish and rye porridge. So not exactly the stuff of sainthood. But her story reminds us how easily the line between miracle and microbiology gets blurred, especially when people are bored, scared, and living in a time when leeches were considered advanced medicine. When people think of Victorian crime solving, the image that often comes to mind is a man in a bowler hat, coat collar turned up, magnifying glass in hand, prowling the foggy streets of London. While fiction gave us Sherlock Holmes, reality gave us Scotland Yard. The Metropolitan Police was founded in 1829 by then Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, but it wasn't long before a special branch of detectives was needed. Ordinary constables could keep the peace, but London was swelling into a metropolis of millions, and with it came daring jewel heists, fraud schemes, and brutal murders. These were crimes too complex for a nightstick and a lantern. In 1842, a small detective branch was created at Scotland Yard, just 8 plainclothes officers who were not easily trusted. To the Victorian public, detectives seemed almost criminal themselves. They didn't wear uniforms, they snooped around in taverns, and they infiltrated gangs by disguising themselves. Newspapers sneered at them as spies and slinkers in the shadows. Respectable citizens worried that detectives blurred the line between lawman and lawbreaker. And yet, when a crime truly baffled the public, everyone turned to Scotland Yard. The early detectives had to prove their worth by solving cases that ordinary policing couldn't touch. They pursued master thieves who specialised in safe-cracking and art theft, tracked down notorious swindlers who preyed on the gullible with elaborate cons, and even uncovered political conspiracies during a time when fears of revolution simmered across Europe. They were, in effect, pioneers of professional detective work in Britain, though their methods were a mixture of instinct, street smarts, and slowly emerging science. What made Scotland Yard's detective branch remarkable was its transformation from a distrusted experiment to a symbol of authority. By the 1860s and 70s, the Yard men were appearing in courtrooms with evidence that carried more weight than mere rumour. Their work shaped the public's idea of what a detective should be: methodical, sharp-eyed, and unyielding. The Yard's reputation was cemented by high-profile cases like the pursuit of the garroters who strangled victims in dark alleys, or the hunt for conmen who impersonated aristocrats to rob banks. Though they began in suspicion, Scotland Yard detectives became indispensable. By the late Victorian era, they were not just men in plain clothes. They were the very embodiment of a new age of crime-solving, where deduction and investigation mattered more than luck and chance. In early Victorian England, murder investigations were often little more than guesswork. A coroner might inspect a body quickly, listen to a few witness statements, and declare a cause of death that satisfied the jury. But as the century unfolded, a revolution began in the morgue. Doctors started to see the corpse not just as a shell of the deceased, but as a book of evidence waiting to be read. This shift marked the birth of forensic autopsies, a practice that would forever change the way crimes were solved. The idea was simple yet groundbreaking. The body itself could testify. Physicians began cutting open stomachs to search for poison, analysing bruises to determine whether injuries were inflicted before or after death, and studying blood patterns to reconstruct the final moments of violence. These practices weren't just grisly rituals. They were the beginnings of a new science. Toxicology emerged as one of the most important fields. Arsenic, known as the inheritance powder for its popularity among would-be heirs, was suddenly detectable through chemical testing. For the first time, a murderer could be undone not by confession or rumour, but by science. The public followed these developments with a mix of fascination and horror. Courtrooms buzzed with excitement when medical experts delivered their findings, brandishing vials and describing chemical reactions that revealed invisible poisons. Newspapers eagerly reported on such cases, turning scientific testimony into a kind of theatre. Suddenly, the grim business of dissection became part of everyday conversation. People realised that crimes once thought unsolvable could now be proven with evidence that could not lie. But the new methods were not without controversy. Many Victorians were deeply uneasy about the desecration of the body, still holding religious or superstitious fears about dissection. Others questioned the reliability of doctors. Could a man in a lab coat truly be more trustworthy than an eyewitness? Mistakes did happen. In some trials, expert witnesses contradicted one another, confusing juries and feeding skepticism. Yet, despite resistance, forensic autopsies slowly gained acceptance. By the latter half of the century, they had become indispensable to criminal investigations. Inquests were no longer just community rituals of judgment. They were stages where science spoke louder than rumour. The autopsy transformed death from a mystery into a source of hard evidence. In doing so, it gave Victorian detectives a powerful ally, proof drawn not from hearsay, but from the silent testimony of the dead. For most of history, proving someone's identity in a criminal case was an unreliable business. Suspects could lie, witnesses could misremember, and even photographs, though emerging in the Victorian age, were far from foolproof. A clever criminal could simply change his name, grow a beard, or vanish into the fog. But in the late 19th century, a tiny detail, no larger than a fingertip, reshaped the future of crime solving. Fingerprinting was born. The idea that fingerprints were unique was not entirely new. Ancient civilizations had noticed patterns on the fingers, but it was Victorian science that transformed curiosity into proof. In the 1880s, Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, began studying fingerprints in detail. He categorized the whorls, loops, and arches that made each print distinct. Galton's work wasn't just academic. It laid the foundation for a system of identification that could stand in court. His studies showed that the odds of two people sharing the same fingerprint were astronomically low, making it the perfect marker of individuality. The first practical use of fingerprints in Britain came in the 1890s, when Sir Edward Henry, then Inspector General of Police in Bengal, developed a classification system that allowed prints to be stored, compared, and retrieved quickly. Known as the Henry system, it was soon adopted by Scotland Yard. Suddenly, identity was no longer based on memory, description, or luck. It was etched permanently in the ridges of a hand. The first major breakthrough came in 1902, just as the Victorian era was ending. A burglar named Harry Jackson was convicted when his fingerprint, left on a freshly painted windowsill, matched the record held by police. It was a quiet revolution. No confessions, no eyewitnesses, just science. The newspapers hailed it as the dawn of a new age, where even the most careful criminal could be betrayed by his own skin. The cultural impact was enormous. To Victorians accustomed to uncertainty, fingerprinting seemed almost magical. as if the body itself carried an unshakable truth. Yet it also carried a chilling message. No matter how clever, no one could escape the forensic eye of the modern police. Fingerprinting bridged the gap between instinctive detective work and hard science. By the century's close, it stood as one of the most powerful tools of identification, a symbol that crime-solving had stepped out of folklore and into the laboratory. Before the Victorian era, catching a repeat offender often relied on memory. Constables might remember a bad character by sight, or victims might try to describe a thief's features, but such methods were fallible. A clever criminal could change his clothes, adopt a new name, and vanish into anonymity. The Victorians, obsessed with cataloguing and classification, sought a better way. Thus emerged two revolutionary tools, the mugshot and the criminal record. Photography was still new in the mid-19th century, but police forces quickly saw its potential. By the 1860s, mugshots were being taken in police stations across Britain. These stark, emotionless portraits, front-facing and profile, were designed not to flatter, but to capture. For the first time, a criminal's face could be permanently stored and compared, no matter how many disguises he tried. Newspapers sometimes reprinted mugshots, much to the horror of respectable Victorians who feared the spread of rogues' galleries. Still, the images gave detectives an edge. A face once forgotten could now be remembered forever, but photographs alone weren't enough. Enter Alphonse Bertillon, a French police officer whose system of anthropometry fascinated the Victorians. Bertillon argued that every human body was unique and measurable: arm span, skull length, ear size. By recording these details alongside a mugshot, police could identify repeat offenders with scientific precision. His methods spread to Britain, where Scotland Yard experimented with meticulous record-keeping. Though later replaced by fingerprinting, Bertillon's system marked the first real attempt to turn the human body into data. The creation of criminal records also reflected the Victorian love of order. Index cards and registers meticulously noted aliases, crimes, and sentences. Detectives could trace a suspect's history across years and cities, building patterns of behaviour. This transformed policing from reactive to proactive. Officers were no longer dealing with isolated crimes, but tracking criminal careers. The cultural significance was profound. For the first time, society grappled with the idea that crime could be studied scientifically, that criminals could be classified much like plants in a botanical garden. To reformers, records promised fairness, evidence over gossip. To critics, they hinted at surveillance and the erosion of privacy. By the end of the century, the criminal record was an institution. With mugshots and files in hand, detectives had built an early database of human misdeeds, one that foreshadowed the information-driven policing of the modern world. If one crime terrified Victorians above all others, it was poisoning. Unlike a pistol shot or a knife wound, poison was invisible, silent, and often delivered at the dinner table by someone trusted. Arsenic, dubbed the inheritance powder, was cheap, tasteless, and available in every chemist's shop. In a society where life insurance was on the rise and family fortunes were tempting, poisoning became the crime of choice for the cold-blooded. The police desperately needed science on their side, and chemistry answered the call. The turning point came in 1836, when English chemist James Marsh devised the Marsh test, a reliable method to detect arsenic in the body. For the first time, prosecutors could present hard scientific evidence of poisoning, rather than relying on circumstantial tales of suspicious tea or sudden illness. The test became famous after a series of sensational trials, where jurors leaned forward in awe as experts demonstrated how a trace of arsenic could be revealed through chemical reaction. Marsh's method turned the laboratory into a courtroom weapon. The Victorians soon demanded more. Other chemists developed techniques to detect strychnine, cyanide, and opium derivatives. Toxicology emerged as a new discipline, and medical experts became indispensable allies to Scotland Yard detectives. It was no longer enough to have a confession. Now the evidence had to be proven, tested, and explained. Murderers who once counted on their cunning were suddenly betrayed by the contents of a victim's stomach, or the sediments in a teacup. These scientific triumphs were not without controversy. Defense lawyers often attacked chemists as charlatans, claiming their tests were flawed or their motives biased. Indeed, early toxicology was still imperfect, and mistakes sometimes sent innocent people to the gallows. Yet with each case, public fascination grew. The Victorian press delighted in publishing the details of chemical tests, turning the science of death into dinner-table conversation. The battle against poisoners also reshaped everyday life. Chemists began labelling dangerous substances more carefully, and the government pushed for stricter regulation of sales. Murderers found it harder to obtain their favourite weapon, though some still tried. The era's fascination with poison gave rise to countless sensational novels and penny dreadfuls, where villains wielded chemistry like black magic. By the late 19th century, forensic chemistry had secured its place in the arsenal of Victorian crime-solving. With each test tube and reaction, science chipped away at murder's cloak of invisibility, proving that even the most subtle crime could leave behind undeniable traces. Before the Victorian age, murder investigations often began with chaos. Crowds would trample through alleys, neighbours rifled through belongings, and policemen themselves sometimes disturbed crucial evidence without realising it. A bloody footprint might be wiped away, a weapon handled by curious hands, and the truth of what had happened forever lost. It was during the 19th century that investigators began to grasp an essential idea. The crime scene itself was a witness. One of the most famous examples was the case of Jack the Ripper in the late 1880s. Though the killer was never caught, the Scotland Yard detectives working Whitechapel's streets tried to apply new methods of observation, cataloguing wounds, sketching crime scenes, and comparing patterns. While their efforts were often hindered by public hysteria and poor lighting, these cases demonstrated the growing importance of preserving the environment of a crime. The Ripper murders, gruesome as they were, forced Londoners to understand that solving crimes required more than catching a suspect. It demanded careful analysis of place and circumstance. Photography soon joined the toolbox. By the 1860s, police forces were beginning to photograph not just criminals, but also crime scenes. Images captured the exact position of bodies, the placement of weapons, and the state of a room before anything was moved. This was revolutionary. For the first time, investigators could revisit a crime scene days or even years later by examining photographs. They could present visual proof to courts and compare details that might otherwise be forgotten. The practice of collecting physical evidence also emerged. Fibres, hair, and even soil samples began to be considered significant. While Victorian scientists did not yet have the tools to analyse DNA or microscopic particles, they recognised that such materials might one day speak volumes. The principle was simple but powerful. Every crime leaves traces. Of course, the process was imperfect. Crime scenes were still compromised, often by sheer curiosity from bystanders or the press. Even police officers struggled to resist tampering with evidence. Yet the seeds of modern forensic protocol had been sown. Investigators learned to mark, measure, and record, rather than disturb. By the end of the Victorian century, the crime scene had evolved from a muddled mess into a structured space of inquiry. Detectives were no longer just chasing suspects. They were reading the silent story written in bloodstains, footprints, and scattered objects. This new awareness elevated the investigation from rumour and instinct to something approaching modern science. By the mid-Victorian era, the detective was no longer just a plainclothes officer lurking in the shadows. He was becoming a cultural icon. Newspapers loved to publish the exploits of Scotland Yard men, often exaggerating their daring to satisfy a public appetite for mystery and justice. At the same time, literature seized on the figure of the detective and transformed him into something larger than life. Fiction and reality began to intertwine in ways that reshaped how crime-solving was understood. Charles Dickens was among the first to popularise the detective. Fascinated by crime and the underworld of London, he often accompanied Scotland Yard officers on patrols. His novels, filled with sharp-eyed characters who sniffed out secrets, prepared readers for the idea that deduction could be an art. Soon after, Wilkie Collins introduced Sergeant Cuff in The Moonstone, 1868, a character modelled on real-life detectives. Cuff was methodical, eccentric, and brilliant at noticing details others missed, a clear ancestor of the world's most famous sleuth, Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes, debuting in 1887, was a product of his age, half scientist, half magician. Holmes employed magnifying glasses, chemical tests, and deductive reasoning in ways that mirrored the genuine advances of Victorian policing. Yet he was also everything the public wanted detectives to be: cool under pressure, disdainful of fools, and always one step ahead. While Scotland Yard men admired Holmes, they also resented him. Readers often assumed the fictional detective was more capable than the real ones. Still, Holmes cemented the detective as a heroic figure of reason and intellect. The cultural fascination with detectives had real consequences. Criminals, once feared, became characters in a narrative of battle between cunning villain and brilliant investigator. Penny dreadfuls and serialized magazines sold tales of cat-and-mouse chases, while real police cases were reported with theatrical flair. The line between entertainment and justice blurred. The Victorian detective, in print and in practice, symbolized society's hope that order could triumph over chaos. Yet there was also unease. Detectives were seen as necessary, but their methods, disguises, infiltration, constant surveillance, made some Victorians nervous. Were these men guardians of justice or professional spies? The paradox only deepened their allure. By the century's close, the detective had become both an indispensable reality and an irresistible myth, embodying the Victorian dream that intellect and observation could pierce even the darkest mysteries. By the late 19th century, Victorians were convinced that science could not only solve crimes, but also predict them. This belief gave rise to an early form of criminal profiling, a mix of anthropology, psychology, and social prejudice that reflected the era's anxieties as much as its ambitions. In an age haunted by urban poverty, violent crime, and the spectre of Jack the Ripper, the idea that one could identify a criminal simply by studying his face or skull was both comforting and terrifying. The roots of profiling lay in phrenology and physiognomy, pseudosciences that claimed the shape of a head or the set of a jaw revealed character. Though discredited today, these ideas had enormous influence in Victorian society. Men like Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist, argued that criminals were atavistic throwbacks to earlier stages of human evolution, recognizable by sloping foreheads, large jaws, or asymmetrical features. His theories spread quickly across Europe and to Britain, where they were eagerly debated in universities, courtrooms, and police circles. At Scotland Yard, detectives began quietly applying such thinking. They were urged to look not just at what a suspect had done, but at what sort of person he was. The Ripper murders in Whitechapel, with their savage brutality, encouraged speculation that the killer must be foreign, insane, or both. Doctors provided psychological sketches of what type of man might commit such acts: solitary, resentful, prone to sexual deviance. While these sketches were crude, they marked the first attempts at understanding criminal behaviour in psychological terms. Profiling also reflected wider Victorian fears. The rapid growth of cities created slums that many middle-class citizens viewed as breeding grounds for vice. Criminal anthropology seemed to confirm these prejudices, painting the poor and immigrant populations as biologically predisposed to crime. Social reformers embraced such theories as justification for controlling or monitoring the urban underclass. Thus, profiling was as much about reinforcing social boundaries as it was about catching killers. Still, amidst the pseudoscience, there were glimmers of genuine progress. Detectives learned to study patterns of behaviour. Repeat offenders often struck in similar places or under familiar conditions. Criminal psychology, however crude, nudged investigations toward understanding motive as well as method. By the end of the Victorian era, profiling had become a controversial but enduring tool. It was both a mirror of society's darkest prejudices and a tentative step toward the modern science of criminal psychology. The Victorians, in their obsession with classification, laid the groundwork for a field that would later evolve into a cornerstone of detective work. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world of policing had been transformed. The Victorians began the century with constables carrying rattles and lanterns, relying on eyewitnesses and coerced confessions. They ended it with detectives using fingerprints, chemical analysis, crime scene photography, and a growing body of forensic science. The transformation was not just technical, it changed the very idea of justice. For the first time in British history, solving crime became less about luck and confession, and more about evidence, science, and procedure. Scotland Yard stood at the heart of this transformation. Its plainclothes detectives, once distrusted as spies, became symbols of modern policing. Their methods inspired admiration abroad, from Paris to New York, where police forces began adopting British practices. Even when cases ended in failure, such as the unsolved Jack the Ripper murders, the public recognised that detectives had tried to apply systematic reasoning rather than superstition or mob justice. This approach marked a decisive step toward professionalism. Victorian innovations also left an enduring cultural legacy. Literature, theatre, and newspapers turned detectives into heroes of rationality. Sherlock Holmes embodied not only the spirit of deduction, but also the Victorian belief that science could conquer mystery. Readers thrilled at the idea that even the darkest crimes could be unravelled by observation and intellect. That confidence in reason spilled over into real policing, reinforcing the idea that science and order would triumph over chaos. But the legacy was not without shadows. Profiling and early criminology, while pioneering, often reinforced social prejudices against the poor, immigrants, and the mentally ill. The same tools that promised fairness could also justify surveillance and control. The Victorian urge to catalogue and classify sometimes blurred the line between protecting society and intruding upon it. Yet, even with these flaws, the groundwork they laid was indispensable for the future. Today's criminal investigations, DNA testing, forensic psychology, digital records, owe much to the Victorians' willingness to experiment. They were the first to imagine a justice system where science, not superstition, held sway. Their successes and mistakes alike created a blueprint for modern forensic practice. The Victorian age began with lantern-lit patrols and ended with laboratories, records, and detectives who were both feared and admired. Their legacy is clear. The meeting of science and crime solving in the 19th century created the foundations of modern policing, ensuring that the voice of evidence would forever speak louder than rumour. For a young man hoping to join the Knights Templar, the journey did not begin with swords or banners, but with silence and shadow. The initiation was held in the stillness of a chapel, usually at night, where flickering candles cast long, wavering shadows across stone walls. The solemn setting was meant to overwhelm the senses, to remind the candidate that he was stepping out of the world of common men and into a life bound by mystery, obedience, and eternal vigilance. Before the ceremony even began, secrecy was emphasized. The initiate was led away from his companions, questioned privately by senior knights, and warned that the vows he was about to take would bind him for life. There could be no turning back. Witnesses were restricted, and no outsider was ever allowed to observe. This veil of secrecy gave the rituals an almost theatrical weight, and it also fueled centuries of speculation. The candidate was then brought before the assembled brothers, kneeling on cold stone in front of the altar. The Grand Master or presiding officer would ask a series of searching questions. Was the man free from debt? Was he married, or under obligation to a lord or bishop? Did he truly understand that he was pledging his life to poverty, chastity, and obedience? These questions were not formalities, they were safeguards. A knight who owed debts, or who had a wife and family, might place divided loyalties above the order. The initiate's responses determined whether he would proceed. If found worthy, he was asked once more if he wished to dedicate himself fully to the order of the temple. Tradition held that the candidate was given several chances to withdraw, lest he claim later that he had been pressured or misled. But once he agreed, the atmosphere intensified. The chapel grew quiet. The brothers bowed their heads, and the initiate prepared to take his oath. This moment was the threshold, the last step before shedding his old identity and becoming a soldier of Christ. From here, the candidate would be stripped of his former life, his clothes replaced with the white mantle of the Templar, and sworn to a rule that demanded complete loyalty. The solemnity of the setting ensured that, when the words of the oath were finally spoken, they carried the weight not only of ritual, but of destiny. Once the initiate had been examined and accepted, the heart of the ceremony began, the taking of the sacred oath. He was led to kneel again before the altar, the dim candlelight glinting off the steel and silver of the assembled knights. This was no casual promise, but a binding contract, one that fused the spiritual vows of the monastic life with the martial discipline of the warrior. Poverty, chastity, and obedience, these were the pillars upon which the order stood, and they would define every aspect of the initiate's future. The vow of poverty was the first, and perhaps the most difficult for many knights to accept. These were men often born into noble families, accustomed to wealth, land, and retainers. By pledging poverty, the initiate renounced all worldly possessions. Any wealth he possessed was turned over to the order, which would now provide for him in common. He would own nothing, not even his sword, which was regarded as belonging to Christ and his order. To a man raised in privilege, this vow was a symbolic death of the self. Next came chastity. In an age where noble lineages and dynasties were preserved through marriage, this oath demanded that the initiate cut himself off from family life entirely. The Templar was to live as a monk, never to marry or pursue women, dedicating his body and spirit solely to God. This vow was often misunderstood by outsiders, who imagined dark or unnatural practices within the order's walls. In truth, it mirrored the vows taken in monasteries across Christendom, but the secrecy of the ceremony fed rumours that the chastity oath masked stranger, more scandalous rites. Finally, obedience bound the initiate completely to the will of his superiors. From this moment onward, his life was not his own. He would march when ordered, fight when commanded, and die if required, without hesitation. The order valued obedience above all, for only through absolute unity could a band of warrior monks function as one body in battle and in faith. As the initiate repeated the words of the oath, the brothers surrounded him in silence. He was no longer merely a man, but a servant of God's temple. The vows stripped him of his past and bound him to a new identity, one that would endure until death, or until the order itself was dissolved. With the vows spoken, the transformation of the initiate moved from words to symbols. Rituals are powerful not only for what is said, but for what is seen and felt, and the Templars understood this well. The most dramatic moment came when the novice was stripped of his worldly clothing and dressed in the distinctive white mantle of the order. To those watching, this was more than a change of garments. It was the outward sign that the man was no longer his own. The mantle itself carried heavy meaning. White symbolized purity of body and soul, a reminder that the knight had sworn chastity and must remain unsullied by earthly desires. In time of war, the mantle was marked with a red cross, the symbol of martyrdom and sacrifice. The red was no decorative flourish. It was a pledge that the wearer was ready to shed his blood for Christ and the defence of the Holy Land. From this moment on, the initiate was not simply a knight, but a Miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. The ceremony often included further symbols. The initiate might be handed a belt and sword, though both were considered property of the order rather than the individual. The sword, blessed in ritual, symbolized both defense of the innocent and punishment of the wicked. It was not to be used for personal gain, vengeance, or glory, but solely for the cause of God. In placing the sword in his hand, the brothers reminded the new knight that his strength was no longer his own. It was consecrated. The ritual was also meant to humble. In some accounts, the initiate was required to lie prostrate before the altar as prayers were chanted above him. Others described the new knight kissing the ground or the cross, acknowledging his lowliness before God and his dependence on divine mercy. These actions reinforced the Order's central teaching. A Templar was not a lord, not a free agent, but a servant bound by duty. When the mantle finally rested on his shoulders, the initiate had been remade. In the eyes of his brothers, he was now part of a sacred fraternity that transcended family, nation, or wealth. The mantle was both a privilege and a burden, a public declaration that this man belonged not to himself, but to the mysterious and powerful Order of the Temple. Once clothed in the white mantle, the initiate entered the most mysterious phase of the ceremony, the prayers whispered in darkness. Unlike the public chants of the church, these words were spoken in hushed tones, passed from elder to novice, as though they were sacred keys to unlock the hidden heart of the Order. The chapel, already dim with candlelight, seemed to grow even darker as the brothers intoned their secret formulas. For the initiate, it was a moment of awe and of unease. The prayers themselves were rooted in Christian liturgy, invoking the Virgin Mary, Christ, and the saints. Yet they were not identical to the mass prayers one might hear in a cathedral. The Templars had their own cadences, their own formulae, known only to those within the Order. To the outside world, this secrecy raised suspicion. Rumours circulated that the knights denied Christ, spat upon the cross, or worshipped strange idols during these prayers. While historians generally agree that such accusations were exaggerated, or even fabricated by enemies of the Order, the very fact that the rituals were private fueled the legends of blasphemy. During these whispered devotions, the initiate was reminded of his vows. Poverty was framed as following the example of Christ, who had no place to lay his head. Chastity was praised as the way of the angels, a purity that allowed the knight to fight without distraction. Obedience was exalted above all, compared to Christ's submission to the will of God. The initiate was urged to see himself not as a man of flesh and pride, but as a vessel for divine will. The brothers surrounding him lent weight to the moment. Their silence between prayers, the rustle of mantles, and the solemn repetition of sacred words created an atmosphere both intimate and overwhelming. It was a reminder that he was now part of a brotherhood that prayed together, fought together, and, if necessary, died together. To outsiders, these secret prayers were proof of the Templars' dangerous hidden knowledge. To those within, they were the cement that bound each knight to the Order. The whispered formulas stitched the vows into the initiate's soul, binding him not only to his brothers, but to mysteries too profound to be spoken aloud in the open world. The vows and prayers marked the spiritual birth of a Templar, but the Order did not simply accept words at face value. To ensure that the initiate truly understood obedience, he was often subjected to trials, small but symbolic tests of loyalty. These were not meant to humiliate, but to engrave the idea that a knight of the Temple must obey instantly, without hesitation, whether in the chapel or on the battlefield. Accounts of these trials vary, and much is clouded by later exaggeration. Some chronicles describe an initiate being commanded to perform a task on the spot, perhaps to kneel for a prolonged time, to remain silent while others mocked him, or to accept a symbolic act of humiliation. Such exercises reminded the novice that pride and independence had no place within the brotherhood. If he could not surrender his will in a simple act, how could he be trusted to hold the line in the chaos of war? Other trials were sterner. A recruit might be asked a final time whether he truly wished to stay, while the brothers pressed him with warnings of hardship. Battles without end, a life without possessions, the constant risk of martyrdom. If he hesitated, he was encouraged to withdraw, for the Order preferred a small band of unwavering men over a host of wavering half-brothers. This insistence on absolute commitment became the foundation of the Templars' reputation for discipline. Enemies of the Order later twisted these trials into dark accusations. The whispered claim that initiates were forced to spit on the cross or deny Christ almost certainly originated from misunderstandings of symbolic obedience tests. Such rumours fueled the charges of heresy that ultimately destroyed the Templars, though historians today recognize them as propaganda rather than truth. What seems clear is that the trials were meant to strip away hesitation, pride, or fear. and to forge a knight utterly devoted to his brothers and his cause. Once the tests were endured, the initiate was embraced by the Brotherhood. From that moment forward, he was expected to obey every command of his superiors, whether it meant defending a pilgrim on a dusty road, riding into hopeless battle, or enduring captivity without complaint. In the Templar vision of loyalty, obedience was not weakness, but strength, the binding force that allowed hundreds of men to act as one body, wielding the will of God as their weapon. After the tension of vows, whispered prayers, and trials, the mood of the initiation often shifted. To seal the new knight's entry into the order, the brothers shared a ritual meal, a feast that was less about indulgence and more about fellowship. The Templars were strict about food, living under a monastic rule, but in the context of initiation, the table itself became a symbol of unity. The initiate, now clad in the white mantle, was led to join his brothers at a long, simple table. There was no silver, no lavish decorations, no marks of personal wealth. The order ate from common dishes, a deliberate sign that all possessions were shared and no man stood above another. Meat was rare in their diet, allowed only on certain days, so the fare often consisted of bread, beans, vegetables, and watered wine. Yet for the new knight, sitting among men who had fought at Jerusalem, Antioch, or Acre, the meal carried a weight beyond the food itself. The ritual feast also reinforced discipline. The Templars followed strict rules even in dining. Silence was kept, readings from scripture accompanied the meal, and no knight was permitted to glance at another's portion with envy. Eating was a sacred act, reminding the order that even the smallest daily routines were done in service to God. For the initiate, it was a lesson in humility. He was not joining a band of glory-seeking warriors, but a disciplined brotherhood bound by rule. There was also joy in this moment. While the vows and trials tested the initiate's resolve, the feast welcomed him fully as a brother. Here he was no longer an outsider, but part of the company, breaking bread with men who had sworn the same oaths and endured the same sacrifices. The act of sharing food was itself a ritual of trust, for knights at table were knights at peace. To outsiders, tales of Templar banquets became distorted into rumours of secret feasts where heresy was practiced in shadow. In reality, these meals were austere, monastic, and symbolic. They were the opposite of indulgence. They embodied unity and discipline. The feast reminded the initiate that from this day onward, every action, from prayer to battle to breaking bread, was done in the company of his brothers and under the gaze of God. Among all the vows spoken by a new Templar, few carried as much weight as the oath of secrecy. Poverty and chastity set him apart from the world, obedience bound him to his brothers, but secrecy shielded the order itself. Without it, the Templars could not maintain their mystique, their unity, or their security in a hostile world. The initiate was warned in stark terms. The words and rites he had witnessed must never be repeated outside the walls of the order. To reveal them was to betray not only his brothers, but God himself. In some accounts, the vow of secrecy was accompanied by gestures of finality, placing a hand on the Gospels, kneeling before the cross, or touching sacred relics. These physical acts etched the vow deep into the memory of the knight. The penalty for betrayal was never spelled out in detail during the ceremony, but the implication was clear. Excommunication, dishonour, and eternal damnation awaited anyone who broke his word. The Templars believed secrecy was not just a matter of discipline, but of survival. The order operated across Europe and the Holy Land, handling vast sums of money, military strategies, and sensitive negotiations. If such matters slipped into the wrong hands, be they kings, rival lords, or enemy armies, the results could be disastrous. It was this cloak of secrecy that fed suspicion among outsiders. Because the rites were hidden, rumours flourished. Whispers spread that the knights worshipped strange idols, spat on the cross, or engaged in obscene rituals behind closed doors. The very oaths that were meant to protect the order ended up painting it as sinister in the imagination of its enemies. Centuries later, these accusations would be weaponized in trials that led to the destruction of the Templars. For the initiate, however, the vow of secrecy was not sinister, but sacred. It marked him as a guardian of mysteries, trusted by his brothers and bound to them in silence. It was a reminder that the Order lived not for the world's approval, but for God's command. By swearing secrecy, the Templar crossed a final threshold. He now held truths he could never share, even at the cost of his life. This invisible bond was as strong as any sword or shield, ensuring that the Order's power remained hidden, disciplined, and feared. As the secrecy vows faded into silence, the initiation turned toward its final sanctification. What had begun as a questioning of loyalty and a stripping of worldly ties now shifted into a moment of blessing. The chapel filled not with whispers of secrecy, but with the solemn cadence of prayer as the brothers called upon God to consecrate the life of their new companion. The presiding master often laid his hands upon the initiate's head or shoulders, invoking divine protection and strength. These blessings were drawn from the language of the church, but tailored to the martial vocation of the order. The knight was prayed over as both monk and soldier, a defender of pilgrims, a scourge of infidels, and a vessel of Christ's will on earth. In some accounts, psalms were sung, chants of victory and steadfastness, echoing like the hymns sung by monks at midnight vigils. The initiate was also reminded of the spiritual promises bound up in his vows. Poverty would not mean deprivation but freedom, for by surrendering wealth he gained a treasure incorruptible. Chastity was framed as a gift of purity, raising him above worldly distraction so that his heart could remain wholly fixed on God. Obedience, the hardest vow of all, was described as the very path Christ himself had walked, submitting even unto death. By embracing these disciplines, the Templar was promised the ultimate reward: salvation, the crown of martyrdom, and eternal fellowship with the saints. At this stage, the language often grew martial. The initiate was told that he now bore the armour of faith and carried the sword of the Spirit. His life was no longer his own. It was a campaign under the command of the heavenly King. Should he fall in battle defending the Holy Land, his death would not be in vain but counted as a martyr's victory. This promise made the risks of the battlefield not merely tolerable, but holy. The blessings ended with a final charge: to live uprightly, to guard the weak, and to uphold the honour of the temple. The assembled brothers then responded with prayers of welcome, sealing the initiate not only to vows of duty, but to a vision of eternal reward. From that moment onward, his path was marked not by chance, but by destiny, sanctified by both ritual and divine promise. With vows spoken, mantle bestowed, and blessings given, the final act of initiation bound the new knight not only to God, but to his brothers. This moment was less about ritual words and more about human connection, the embrace of fraternity that turned the initiate from an outsider into one of the order's own. The senior knight, often the master or commander of the house, would step forward and welcome the initiate with the kiss of peace, a gesture drawn from monastic tradition and the wider church. It was usually given on the cheek or shoulder, a sign of equality and reconciliation. One by one, the other knights followed suit, offering the same embrace. For the new member, this was a powerful signal. He was no longer alone, no longer a stranger kneeling in shadows. He now shared the same destiny as every man in that chapel. The ceremony closed with words of brotherhood. The initiate was reminded that the temple was a family, stronger than blood, bound together in prayer and battle. From this day forward, he was to eat at their table, ride under their banner, and share both their hardships and their glories. The order demanded much: poverty, chastity, obedience, and secrecy. But it gave in return the unbreakable fellowship of men who lived and died together. After the formal embrace, the new knight was often led to his place among the others, as though he had always been there. His name was recorded in the rolls of the house, a written sign that his life was now woven into the history of the temple. He had become part of something larger than himself, an international brotherhood stretching from castles in Europe to fortresses in the Holy Land. The embrace carried a weight beyond the moment. To betray the order would now mean betraying not only vows and symbols, but the faces of the men who had welcomed him. To fight bravely was to honour them. To falter was to let them down. The embrace was not just welcome, it was a lifelong reminder that loyalty was owed not only to God, but to the brotherhood of the temple. Thus ended the initiation. What began in secrecy and solemn testing concluded in fellowship. The knight rose from the chapel floor no longer merely a man, but a Templar, clothed in vows, strengthened by blessings, and embraced by a brotherhood that promised both earthly unity and eternal reward. When the Knights Templar first emerged in the early 12th century, they were not known as builders. Their mission was simple: protect pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land. Yet almost immediately, they recognized that swords alone could not secure the highways of faith. Roads could be patrolled, but safe havens were essential. Thus began the Templars' transformation from warrior monks into architects of some of the most formidable castles the medieval world had ever seen. Unlike the castles of kings or feudal lords, Templar strongholds did not serve dynasties or families. They were communal structures, owned by the order and consecrated to Christ. Each fortress represented not personal glory, but collective mission: to defend the Christian world against enemies and to provide sanctuary for travellers. Their castles became both military hubs and spiritual symbols, stone sermons rising out of the landscape. Templar fortifications were strategically placed. They anchored trade routes, guarded mountain passes, and dominated coastal harbours. Many were erected along the frontiers of Crusader states, where the clash between Christian and Muslim forces was constant. In Europe, their castles safeguarded treasure houses, training grounds, and commanderies that fueled the Order's global network. Wherever a Templar fortress stood, it announced stability and power, often in lands plagued by conflict. Architecturally, these castles combined brute strength with subtle symbolism. Their walls were thick, their towers carefully angled to repel siege engines, and their gates designed to funnel invaders into deadly traps. Yet within those walls lay chapels where knights gathered to pray before battle. The contrast was deliberate. Stone bastions of war sheltering quiet sanctuaries of faith. Every fortress, from the deserts of Syria to the green hills of Portugal, embodied the dual identity of the Templar, monk and soldier. To medieval eyes, these fortresses seemed unshakable. They projected an image of divine protection, as though God himself had lent strength to the stones. Pilgrims who entered their gates saw more than battlements. They saw a vision of the church militant, unyielding before the storms of war. And for enemies, a Templar castle was both a military obstacle and a spiritual statement. The cross carved into its walls was as daunting as the swords of the men inside. In building castles, the Templars built more than defences. They built monuments to their mission, fusing architecture with ideology. These warrior fortresses were not merely shelters of stone, but enduring symbols of a holy cause. If there was ever a fortress that embodied the Templar vision of strength and faith, it was Crac de Chevalier. Rising above the Syrian plains, this massive stone citadel was more than a military outpost. It was a statement of permanence in a land defined by shifting battles and fragile Crusader states. Perched on a hill nearly 650 metres above sea level, Crac dominated the surrounding landscape, its silhouette visible for miles. For pilgrims, it was a beacon of safety. For enemies, it was a daunting reminder of the Crusaders' determination to stay. Crac de Chevalier was originally built by local lords, but in 1142 it was entrusted to the Templars' brother order, the Knights Hospitaller. Still, its design and use reflected the same principles that guided all Templar construction. The fortress became the gold standard of Crusader military architecture: double concentric walls, deep moats carved from living rock, and a series of towers that allowed defenders to rain arrows and stones upon attackers from every angle. Each wall contained passageways for swift movement, ensuring that soldiers could be deployed wherever the threat was greatest. Inside the fortress, practicality blended with spirituality. Vast storage rooms allowed Krak to withstand sieges lasting years, while a chapel stood at its heart, reminding the knights that their battles were fought under divine sanction. The chapel's austere design reflected the order's vow of simplicity. No gilded ornaments, no flamboyant decoration, only the stark beauty of stone and the glow of candlelight. For Muslim chroniclers, Krak was a nightmare. The fortress resisted repeated assaults and stood as a nearly impregnable bastion during the height of the Crusades. Saladin himself attempted to take it, but even his formidable armies could not breach its walls. Only in 1271, after decades of defiance, did the fortress finally fall to Sultan Baybars. Even then, legend holds that the defenders surrendered not through force, but through a forged letter tricking them into believing their masters had ordered retreat. To this day, Krak des Chevaliers is regarded as one of the finest examples of medieval military engineering in the world. Its walls tell a story not just of stone and mortar, but of ideology, the merging of knightly discipline with monastic devotion. For the Templars and their peers, Krak was more than a fortress. It was the crown jewel of a sacred war, a monument to the belief that faith could be defended with both prayer and steel. While the Holy Land drew most of the Templars' fame, their castles in Portugal tell a different but equally fascinating story. Here, on the far western edge of Europe, the Order played a vital role in the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. Portuguese kings quickly recognized the Templars as invaluable allies, granting them lands and resources in exchange for their military support. In return, the knights built fortresses that anchored the Christian frontier and helped forge the identity of the emerging Portuguese nation. One of the most iconic of these strongholds is Tomar, founded in 1160 by Grand Master Gualdim Pais. Rising on a hill above the Nabão River, Tomar became the Templars' headquarters in Portugal and later one of the most important commanderies in Europe. Its round church, inspired by the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, symbolized the Order's direct link to the sacred sites of the Crusades. Unlike the austere chapels of the East, Tomar blended military utility with artistic flourishes, foreshadowing the fusion of Templar and Portuguese culture. But Tomar was not alone. Across central Portugal, the Templars erected a chain of fortresses, Almirol, perched dramatically on a rocky island in the Tagus River, Monsanto, carved into granite cliffs, and Pombal, controlling vital roads. These castles were not merely defensive, they were statements of control. Each fortress secured conquered territory, safeguarded Christian settlers, and provided staging points for further campaigns southward. Their presence ensured that the frontier advanced steadily, brick by brick, stone by stone. The architecture of these Portuguese castles reflected both local tradition and Crusader innovation. Thick curtain walls, elevated towers, and narrow gateways mirrored Eastern designs, while their placement exploited Iberia's rugged terrain. Many of the fortresses also included cloisters and chapels, underscoring that these were not castles of feudal lords, but of warrior monks who lived by rule and prayer. In time, when the Templar Order was suppressed, their Portuguese holdings did not vanish. Instead, they passed into the hands of the Order of Christ, a successor institution that carried on Templar traditions. Under this banner, Portuguese explorers would sail into the Atlantic and beyond, using Tomar as both a spiritual and logistical base for voyages that reshaped the world. Thus, the Templar castles of Portugal stand as western bastions of their mission, fortresses that guarded a frontier, forged a kingdom, and laid the foundations for global exploration. In England, the Templars' castles and commanderies carried a slightly different purpose than their counterparts in the Holy Land or Iberia. Here, the Order was less concerned with defending contested frontiers and more invested in consolidating wealth, training recruits, and safeguarding the flow of resources that sustained the crusading effort abroad. Yet their English strongholds still bore the unmistakable stamp of Templar architecture, an austere blend of martial utility and spiritual devotion. The most famous of these was the Temple in London, established in the mid-12th century. While not a fortress in the traditional sense, it was a fortified enclave in the very heart of the city. Its round church, modelled after the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, remains one of the best surviving examples of Templar design in Western Europe. Here, knights trained, prayed, and managed the financial dealings of the order. The London Temple became a hub of international banking, where monarchs deposited treasure and pilgrims secured safe passage to the east. Its defences were less about battlements and more about law, influence, and the sacred authority the order wielded. Beyond London, the Templars established castles in strategic rural sites. In Lincolnshire, they fortified Witham and Temple Brewer, both serving as centres of administration and recruitment. Templehurst in Yorkshire and Rothley in Leicestershire were similar outposts, less massive than Crack or Tomar, but vital nodes in the Templar network. Each included a chapel, cloisters, and barns, combining monastic simplicity with military readiness. Their defensive features were modest, moats, walls, and towers, but their role was crucial: to collect rents, train knights, and funnel wealth toward the crusading front. These English sites reveal another dimension of Templar architecture: symbolism. Round churches, echoing the shape of Jerusalem's most sacred shrine, created a direct architectural link between England and the Holy Land. For medieval worshippers, entering such a space meant stepping into a small fragment of Jerusalem itself. The walls of these churches were plain, but their geometry carried powerful meaning, suggesting unity, eternity, and divine perfection. Though few of England's Templar castles rivaled the scale of Crac de Chevalier or Tomar, their influence was no less significant. They stitched the order into the social and economic fabric of the realm, ensuring that English wealth and manpower flowed eastward in support of the crusading cause. Today, the surviving round churches and ruins of preceptories stand as quiet reminders that the Templar mission was global, stretching from the deserts of Syria to the heart of London. If the Holy Land was the battlefield of the Templars, France was their heartland. It was here that the order was born in the early 12th century, and it was in French soil that many of its most important commanderies and fortresses took root. Unlike the massive bastions of the East, French Templar sites often combined the functions of monastery, manor, and fortress. They were centres of administration and recruitment, but their architecture still bore the unmistakable character of an order that lived by the sword and the cross. One of the most notable sites was the commandery of La Couvertoirade in southern France. Surrounded by rugged plateaus, it became a fortified village where knights and local inhabitants lived side by side. High stone walls, towers, and a formidable gate protected not just the knights, but also the community that supported them. Within the walls stood a chapel, barracks, and storage houses, practical, austere, and utterly Templar. The fortress reflected the dual purpose of the order, to defend and to provide sanctuary. In central France, places like Arville and Pains served as training grounds for recruits. These were not sprawling castles like Crac de Chevalier, but self-contained compounds with chapels, halls, and defensive walls. They reflected the order's disciplined lifestyle: simple quarters, communal dining, and constant readiness for military service. Every structure was designed to remind the knights of their vows. No luxury, no excess, only what was necessary for devotion and defence. French Templar sites also played a vital financial role. They stored donations, managed estates, and provided the wealth that funded campaigns in the Holy Land. For this reason, many commanderies were fortified not against armies, but against bandits and rival lords who might be tempted by the treasures within. The architecture was pragmatic: walls, towers, and moats that deterred opportunistic raids while projecting an aura of authority. Yet beyond stone and mortar, these castles carried symbolism. The chapels, often plain but geometric, echoed the simplicity of Cistercian design, linking the Templars to the wider reform movement of the Church. The round structures, when present, evoked the Holy Sepulchre, reinforcing the order's spiritual mission. France was also where the Templars met their tragic end. Castles that had once symbolised strength became prisons, when King Philip IV turned against the order in 1307. Many were confiscated, repurposed, or abandoned. Still, the ruins of French commanderies whisper of the days when the Templar network stretched from humble farms to impregnable strongholds, all united in service to a cause greater than any single kingdom. In Spain, the Knights Templar were drawn into one of medieval Europe's longest and most defining struggles, the Reconquista. Here, castles were not just symbols of power. They were critical tools of survival on a frontier that shifted constantly between Christian and Muslim control. Spanish kings welcomed the Templars, granting them vast tracts of land in exchange for military service, and the order responded by raising fortresses that anchored the Christian advance. One of the most iconic of these was the Castle of Ponferrada in Leon. Originally a Roman outpost, it was rebuilt and expanded by the Templars in the late 12th century. The fortress grew into a sprawling complex of towers, courtyards, and thick curtain walls, guarding the pilgrims' road to Santiago de Compostela. Pilgrims found safety within its gates, while enemies found an imposing wall of stone blocking their ambitions. The blend of utility and faith, the protection of travellers bound for a holy shrine, was quintessentially Templar. Farther east, in Aragon, the castle of Monzon became a crucial Templar stronghold. Rising from a rocky hill, it commanded the surrounding plains and served as both fortress and training ground. It gained fame as the place where the young King James I of Aragon was raised under Templar guardianship, highlighting the order's role not only as warriors, but also as political players. Monzon's design reflected their disciplined style: massive walls, rectangular towers, and austere interiors punctuated by chapels that reminded the knights of their vows. Other fortresses, like Peñíscola on the Mediterranean coast and Miravet overlooking the Ebro River, demonstrated the order's skill in adapting architecture to diverse landscapes. Peñíscola rose dramatically from a rocky promontory surrounded by sea, while Miravet's layered walls and Romanesque chapel created a commanding presence above fertile valleys. Each fortress was tailored to its environment, yet carried the same message. The Templars were immovable defenders of Christendom. The Spanish Templar castles reveal the order's dual role in Iberia. They were guardians of borders and protectors of pilgrims, but they were also instruments of colonization, securing new territories for Christian settlement. When the order was dissolved in the early 14th century, many of these fortresses passed into the hands of rival military orders such as Calatrava or Montesa, ensuring their continued use in the Reconquista. Today, their ruins still crown Spain's hills and coastlines, reminders of an age when the cross and the sword were carved not only into history, but into the very stones of the land. Beyond the towering presence of Crac des Chevaliers, the Templars maintained a network of castles across the Holy Land that embodied their mission: to secure pilgrim routes, defend Christian enclaves, and project authority deep into contested territories. Each fortress was a statement of endurance, a declaration that the Knights of the Temple were not temporary crusaders, but permanent guardians of Christendom in the East. One of the most important of these was Safed, perched high in Galilee. Rebuilt by the Templars in the mid-13th century, it commanded sweeping views over valleys and trade routes. Safed was more than a military post. It was an administrative centre, complete with living quarters, storerooms, and a chapel. Its altitude made it nearly unassailable, a fortress in the sky that reminded both allies and enemies that the Templars were watching from above. In the deserts of Jordan, the castle of Kerak stood as another bastion. Although primarily held by other Crusader lords, the Templars often cooperated in its defence. Its massive walls and deep dungeons symbolised the brutal realities of frontier warfare. Further north, at Bagras and Tortosa, Templar castles guarded crucial mountain passes and coastal lines, creating a chain of strongpoints that supported both trade and military movement. Each fortress worked not in isolation, but as part of a larger system, allowing the order to respond rapidly to threats. These Holy Land castles shared common features: concentric walls, narrow gates, and towers positioned for maximum defence. Yet within their hard exteriors lay chapels that anchored the knight's spiritual life. Daily prayers and masses punctuated the routines of garrison duty, reminding the brothers that their labour was as much service to God as it was to strategy. For Muslim chroniclers, these castles were symbols of foreign intrusion, but also grudgingly admired for their engineering. Siege after siege tested their walls, with some fortresses holding out for months or years before succumbing. Even when they fell, they left behind legends of resistance that magnified the Templars' reputation. Ultimately, the loss of the Holy Land in the late 13th century marked the decline of these castles. Many were dismantled or absorbed into Muslim fortifications. Yet their ruins still cling to hillsides and coastlines, silent witnesses to the age when warrior monks built outposts of both faith and war at the very heart of the Crusades. Templar castles were not merely fortresses of war, they were sermons written in stone. Every arch, wall, and chapel was infused with spiritual meaning, reflecting the order's dual identity as both monks and warriors. While their fortifications had to withstand catapults, sieges, and fire, their architecture also spoke of obedience, discipline, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. One of the clearest expressions of this symbolism lay in the round churches built within or beside their castles. Modelled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, these circular sanctuaries reminded knights that they were spiritually tied to Christ's tomb, the very centre of their mission. To worship in such a space was to stand, symbolically, in Jerusalem itself, even if the castle lay in England or France. The circle also carried deeper meaning: unity, eternity, and the divine order that the Templars believed they defended with their swords. Crosses carved into walls, gateways, and towers reinforced this message. Sometimes painted in red, sometimes cut directly into stone, the cross reminded all who entered that the fortress belonged not to a lord or king, but to Christ. The red cross on the knights' mantles was mirrored in their architecture, turning their castles into visual extensions of their vow. Even the placement of castles carried spiritual undertones. High hilltops symbolized divine watchfulness, as if the fortress itself were an earthly counterpart to a heavenly citadel. Castles that guarded pilgrim routes doubled as metaphors of protection, suggesting that the Order's mission was not only military, but also pastoral, guiding souls as well as defending bodies. The interior spaces too reflected monastic discipline. Chapels were often simple, devoid of luxury, their plain walls emphasizing humility. Living quarters were austere, reminding the knights daily of their vows of poverty. Even the refectories where they shared meals were designed to embody equality. Long tables without seats of honor, reinforcing that all brothers stood equal before God. To outsiders, this symbolism could appear intimidating, even secretive. The combination of martial strength and spiritual imagery gave rise to rumors of hidden rites and esoteric meanings. Yet to the Templars themselves, the message was clear. Their castles were earthly reflections of a higher divine order. In stone, they proclaimed the union of cross and sword, faith and fortitude. Thus, Templar castles were never just about walls and towers. They were about identity, visible monuments to a brotherhood that sought to embody heaven's order on earth. When the Templar order was dissolved in the early 14th century, their castles did not vanish with them. Stone has a way of outlasting human institutions, and the fortresses of the temple continued to stand long after the knights themselves were dragged to trial or burned at the stake. Some were seized by kings hungry for wealth and land, others were handed over to rival military orders, and a few quietly crumbled into ruin. Yet, in every case, the legacy of Templar architecture endured. In Portugal, many castles were absorbed by the Order of Christ, the Templars' official successor. Tomar, with its iconic round church, became the spiritual and logistical heart of Portuguese expansion, nurturing the explorers who would launch voyages into the Atlantic and beyond. The very stones that once guarded pilgrim roads now formed the cradle of global exploration. In this way, the architectural legacy of the Templars helped lay the groundwork for the Age of Discovery. In Spain, castles like Monzon, Miravet, and Peñíscola passed to the Order of Montesa or other knightly groups who continued the struggle of the Reconquista. Their walls remained frontiers of war until the last Muslim strongholds fell centuries later. Even stripped of their original owners, the fortresses carried forward the martial and spiritual mission that had inspired their construction. Elsewhere, the story was darker. In France, many Templar commanderies were confiscated by the crown and repurposed as secular estates. Some became prisons, others administrative centres. The aura of secrecy that had surrounded their chapels and halls only grew in legend, fueling tales of hidden treasures, secret passages, and curses that lingered in the stones. England's round churches, like those in London and Cambridge, survived dissolution by being adopted into the fabric of later institutions. The Temple Church in London, for example, passed into the care of the legal societies that still occupy the area today. The Templar imprint remained not just in architecture, but in cultural memory, symbols of loyalty, mystery, and betrayal. Today, many of these castles stand as ruins visited by tourists, while others still serve as places of worship or community. They remind us that the Templars' story is not just one of trial and execution, but of endurance. Their castles, blending military ingenuity with spiritual symbolism, outlived their builders. In stone, the Templars achieved what they could not in politics: permanence.